Dear learner, welcome you all on this SWAYAM platform where we are dealing with the course Understanding Competition Law, Theory and Practice. Now, I am your instructor and we are dealing with this fifth module, particularly which is based on dominant position and regulation of abuse of dominant. Today, we will take up with third lecture of this particular module where we will discuss the meaning of dominant position. And the objective of today's session is to discuss the meaning, concept and definition of dominant position under Competition Act 2002 in India. So, going to continue in detail with this session, just have a remind previous lecture, that is what we have discussed in previous lecture or previous session. We have discussed the meaning of relevant market. If you remember what we are discussing, that dominant position and what section 4 about the dominancy or regulation of or prohibition of dominancy stated that the abuse of dominant position in relevant market, so that only dominancy is not important, that dominancy must be in a particular market which is known as relevant market. So, for this purpose of analysis of relevant market, in last session we have discussed with the meaning of relevant market, where we have discussed the relevant market is a term which is already defined in the Act and which has twofold: relevant product market and relevant geographic market. So, if you remember, relevant market refer to the line of commerce in which competition has been restrained, and the geographical area involved which defined to include all reasonable substitute product or services and all nearby competitor to which consumer could turn into near term of restraint which abuse to rate price not only the insignificant amount. That is, if you take in a general term, the relevant market identify the particular product, service or class which is under some given geographical area. So that the relevant market, which is defined under section 2 subclause R, there are some relevant term which is under consideration for the purpose of to relevant market, to consider the relevant market, which are given under section 19 subclause 7. So, we have already discussed the meaning of relevant market, product market, geographic market. Now, we are at the stage where we have to understand that dominancy and the establishment of dominancy in the relevant market is important. So, for the purpose of establishing in the dominant position, the first step what we have already discussed, the meaning of relevant market, and today we will discuss with the term dominant position. What is dominant position? If you see in the realm of the competition law, the term dominant position refer to the scenario where an enterprise enjoy a position of strength in market, enabling it to influence market dynamics significantly. And this concept is pivotal to ensuring fair competition, as it addresses situations where a firm market power could potentially harm competitor, consumer or the market itself. The standard dominant firm model assumes that there is one big firm, a large number of small price taking firm, typically referred to as a competitive fringe, and because of its dominant position, the dominant firm is modeled as selecting a price that the firm take a given in how much apply. Means a firm is in dominant position in the market when it is in a position to you can say exercise a high degree of market control. That means if a person in a dominant position is able to set prices to the other market condition without significant constraint from the competitor or consumer reaction. That means if a person in a dominant position will thus be able to initiate and maintain the appreciable increases in price or reduction in supply, quality or degree of innovation without suffering an adverse impact on probability in short or long term. If you see what is stated in the Cutts International Monograph or Investment and Competition 2000, for your reference purpose, I have mentioned the reference material, so you may access this. A firm enjoying a dominant position in the market gets certain advantage similar to those of a monopolistic, such as fixing of price and allowing demand to determine output, or setting output and allowing demand to set the price. Dominance, therefore, comes with market power. The concept of market power thus is important, and consideration of dominance and its abuse. Anderson, Daniel and Himmler in 1999 explain the concept as follow. And the concept of market power refer to the ability of firm to probability of the maintained price above competitive level for a significant period of time. The qualifier probability is important, which denotes the fact that in order to exercise market power, a firm must be in position to raise price without losing sales so rapidly that the price increase is unprofitable and must be resided, as would be the case is competitive market. And in addition to the higher than competitive prices, the exercise of market power can be manifested through reduced quality of product or service or a lack of innovation in the relevant market. So with this, if you see this observation, the important point is dominant position must be like where there is a dominancy in terms of the control in the market. And how the control is market, only control in the market is not important. There are several other terms and conditions for the purpose of consideration for CIC to identify the dominancy. We will discuss later. But just see what is the definition of this term dominant position under Indian law. If you see the Indian Competition Act, the Indian position regarding the dominance is currently governed by the Act, you know, that is Competition Act 2002, and which deals in the matter in detail. But before going into it, it will be worth to take a look at the position in old law. If you remember the old law, what we have already discussed, the MRTP Act 1969. Of course, there were no any definition like the dominant position or dominant market, but the provision of this act were targeted as dominant undertaking, and the result firm were being hit merely due to the size, and the term dominant undertaking was defined under section 2 subclause D, and the definition was like the dominant undertaking means an undertaking which by itself or along with interconnected undertaking produced, supplies, distributes or otherwise controls not less than 1/4 of the total goods that are produced, supplied or distributed in India or any substantial part thereof, or an undertaking which provides or otherwise control not less than 1/4 of any service that are rendered in India or any substantial part thereof. The SVS Raghavan committee set up by the government laid down in crystal clear terms that although dominance is a necessary condition for establishing the violation of provision regarding abuse of dominant position, it is by no means a sufficient condition. Therefore, the committee suggested that dominance and dominant undertaking may be appropriately defined in the competition law in terms of position of strength enjoyed by any undertaking which enable it to operate independently of the competitive pressure in the relevant market and also to appreciably affect the relevant market, competitor and consumers by its action. So, following the Raghavan committee recommendation in Competition Act 2002, it was enacted, and when it was enacted under the section 4 prohibiting there are provisions regarding the provision for the purpose of abuse, that means prohibiting the abuse of dominant position by the enterprises. If you see the section 4 of this act, that means of Competition Act 2002, and if you read, it is like, first, no enterprise shall abuse its dominant position. Very clear. No enterprise shall abuse its dominant position, meaning thereby it is important that only dominancy is not important or restricted or prohibited or regulated under this act. The regulation is regarding the prohibition of only one may take advantage, or one is taking advantage of its dominant position in the form of abusing by the conduct. That's why no enterprises says abuse in dominant position. And if you see the explanation A of clause 2 of this section, which defined the dominant position as, dominant position means a position of strength enjoyed by enterprise in relevant market in India, which enable it to, there are two parts. First, operate independently of competitive forces prevailing in the relevant market or affect its competitor or consumer or relevant market in favor. Means this is very clear that if you see the conceptual definition of the term dominant position, the statutory definition is very clear. Statutory definition defines dominant position just means it is a position of strength of an enterprises. That means what is the position of the enterprises regarding that hence means how a enterprise is enjoyed is strength, not in market or the market which is any type of market, but that must be in relevant market. Relevant market is a term we have already discussed. Relevant market means a particular market where if it is a geographical market, the particular region which can be considered by the cost, transferability and the region itself, or like the product market where one product can be interchanged or substituted by the other subject, like what we have discussed in alternate to the butter and margarine. So in this scenario, the important thing is first you have to determine the relevant market, and if you find in the particular relevant market if any enterprises enjoyed is strength, that means it is in dominant position, but only when it enjoyed its position by operating independently to competitive force prevailing the relevant market. That means what the forces are prevailing in such relevant market, against such prevailing forces, if the enterprise is able to operate independently, or particularly the second part, if the relevant market is affects its competitor or consumer, then you can say that enterprise is in dominant position. So it is interesting to note that dominant position is not defined on the basis of arithmetical parameter, but any particular share of market, as is the case in MRTP Act 1969. But on the other hand, dominance of an enterprise is to judged by its power and operate independently by competitive forces or affect its customer and consumer in its favor. So that an enterprise with a share of say not less than 25% of the market could be possibly determined. Somehow if you say the general position is if the market share is not less 50% of, that means is in position. So that dominant, if it is satisfy the above criteria, on the other hand an enterprise with the higher market share may not be considered dominant if it does not meet the criteria mentioned in the Act, and if it was under the 1969 MRTP Act. But the Act also lays down a number of factors which the Commission need to take into consideration in determining whether an enterprise is enjoying its interest or the strength like the dominant position or not. And such a market share, size, resources of enterprises, importance of customer, competitors, economic power of enterprises, vertical integration and the enterprises entry barrier, etc., which could involve a fair amount of economic analysis. So, just for the sake of the interpretation or understanding, if you take the jurisprudence of the other jurisdiction, That means if you take the law of the various country or numerous country which prohibit or declare is illegal the abuse of dominant position or monopoly or monopolize the misuse of market power or provide for a prohibition for certain conduct by undertaking in a dominant position having a substantial degree of market power. But the manner in which dominant position, monopoly or substantial degree of market power is defined is different in different countries. The general definition of dominant position or market power followed in jurisdiction such as the European Commission, United Kingdom, Australia, Germany, India take into account the ability of a firm or enterprise to behave independently of its competitor and take an absence of competition and constraint from the conduct of competitor. For example, if you see the section 19 sub clause 2 of Germany Act, that is German Act, which restraint on competition gives a general definition which takes into account such as predominant position in market, the absence of competition, completely or no substantial exposure to competition, and which state that an undertaking is dominant where as a supplier or purchaser of certain kind of goods or commercial service, there are two aspects, has no competitor on the exposure of substantial competition, that means absence of any other competitor. And second one, has a paramount market position in relation to the competitor, and for the purpose amount shall be taken in particular of its market share, its financial power, its access to supplies or market, its link with other undertaking, legal or factual barrier to market entry by other undertaking, actual or potential competition by undertaking established within or outside area of application of this act, and its ability to shift its supply or demand to other goods or commercial services, as well as ability of the opposite market side to restore the other undertaking. And if you see the European Commission, that is Article 86 of the treaty prohibit the abuse of dominance, but it does not contain a definition of dominance. Leaving it to the judicial discretion, it was defined by the Court of Justice in United Brand case that a dominant position is a position of economic strength enjoyed by the undertaking which enable it to prevent effective competition being maintained in relevant market by giving it the power to behave to an appreciable extent independently of its competitor, customers and ultimately of consumers. And this is often quoted as characterization of a dominant position. Similar observations were made by the court in Hoffman-La Roche case in NV, Neverland, Banden, Industrial Milson, and the Commission of European Communities in 1983 that according to the Competition Act of United Kingdom, Section 18 subclause 3, dominant position means dominant position within the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom means United Kingdom or any part of it. That is very clear. And Section 46 subclause 3 under the Australian trade practice, if you see, in determining the degree of power which is a firm enjoy in given market, it should be judged whether the conduct of such firm is constrained by the conduct of competitor or potential competitor or supplier or consumer. This is similar to the independent test of European Union. So, what we have discussed that the position is very clear. The dominant position you cannot calculate in a arithmetic parameter like what does it actually means. That means by controlling the market share in certain percentage or by imposing your economic power or having the certain amount of share or control. It does not mean they are maybe the considerable materials or the factor which may be taken into account under the act what we are discussing here, but the actual position is dominant position means a strength of that enterprises where that enterprises enjoyed that strength in a relevant market in terms of the other competitor where without affecting factor. So that under the Competition Act 2002, the definition of the meaning of the dominant position is provided in explanation A to section 4, and which states again what we are discussing here. Dominant position is clearly a position of strength enjoyed by enterprise in relevant market in India, and the strength which is enjoyed by the enterprises enable to it means which enable to the enterprise. For what purpose? For there are two things: for operate independently of the competitive force prevailing in relevant market, or affect its competitor or consumer or the relevant market in its favor. So this definition highlights that there are two key aspects. First, position of strength, and second, relevant market. Relevant market, what we have already discussed, the assessment of dominance is confined to the specific market defined by the product market or geographical market, or in the context of both. And the second, position of strength. Position of strength, if you see, dominance is not merely about the market share, but about the ability of exert significant influence over the market due to firm's strength. Means this definition emphasizes a behavioral approach rather than a purely structured one. And for example, it is based solely on market share threshold, and it focuses on the enterprise's capacity to act independently of the competitive pressure or to manipulate market condition in its favor. This aligns with global competition law principles such as those in European Union, but is tailored in Indian economic context. That means it is a very customized form what we are seeing or experiencing in Indian market. That is the meaning of dominance position. And if you see, the Act's approach mark a departure from its predecessors, that the Monopolies and Restricted Trademark Practices Act of 1969, which actually targeted the dominant undertaking, which was actually based on the size and market share, and the threshold was almost 25%. And the Competition Act enacted Act in 2002 and enforced progressively from 2009, adopt more dynamic and effective based framework which recognized the dominance alone is not anti-competitive, but its abuse that is prohibited. So to determine an enterprises hold a dominant position in the market, the Competition Commission have to consider the various factors, and the various factors are the factors which are given under this act. So in today's session, what we are taking with this session is like, what is dominant position? Dominant position is a position of strength which is enjoyed by an enterprises, but that is in relevant market. Why it is important? It is important because section 4 is a regulation which prohibit the anti-competitive effect about the enterprises where this enterprise actually abuse its dominant position. If you understand, if you see section 4 subclause 1, which actually state that prohibition of abuse of dominant position in relevant market. That means there are two important things: dominancy and relevant market. Relevant market we have already discussed in last lecture. So today we have discussed the meaning of dominance position, and there are certain factors on which dominance fact must be gathered on. So on this lecture we are able to understand the meaning of, we can understand the concept of the dominant position under the Indian competition law. So with this we will meet in next session where we will discuss the determination of dominant position, or what are the factors to be considered to determine whether there is a dominancy or position of dominance of enterprises or not. So with this, for today's session, thank you.